Let's get started on chapter 10, talking about personality. So take a moment really briefly. You might want to pause the video, but think about how you would define personality and try to think about it before maybe you read the chapter. If you haven't read it yet, maybe even better. But before you learned how in psychology we define personality, how would you have described it? And what do you think is meant by the term personality? Additionally, I want you to think about how you might identify someone else's or your own personality. So, what measures would you have used to say that they showed one personality over another? So, for example, looking at this picture, how might you categorize each of these individuals' personalities? So, this might age me a little bit, but I did grow up watching this show as it aired live. It was one of my favorite shows to watch every week. But hopefully, it isn't so old that you don't all know who these characters are, right? This is the cast of Friends. And if you've ever watched the show at all, you would probably say that all of these characters have very different personalities, right? Monica is what people would say type A personality, right? She's kind of neurotic. She likes everything just so cleaned a certain way. And on the polar opposite, you would have like Phoebe and Joey, who are really relaxed, laid back. They don't really care about that sort of thing. And you might talk about certain behaviors that they engage in as well, right? That leads you to categorize them in one personality over another. Webster's dictionary defines personality as the sum total of all behavioral and mental characteristics that contribute to making an individual unique from others. Okay, so that's sort of just your broad general definition of what personality is. But from the perspective of psychology, personality is a pattern of characteristics that produce both consistency and individuality in a given person. So, personality really encompasses both those behaviors that make you unique or different from others, but also that those behaviors that you engage in consistently in different situations over extended periods of time. So, we're looking at not only individualism or individualistic characteristics, but also behaviors that are consistent for you across different situations. So, really, the two core elements of personality are consistency and distinctiveness. So, consistency, like I previously mentioned, is behaving in a certain manner across a variety of situations. This is basically saying that you're going to engage in very similar behaviors no matter the situation, no matter what situation you're in. Okay, so that's consistency versus distinctiveness, which refers to the way in which people respond differently than others when they're all presented with the same situation. So, how you behave differently from other people, but when you're all in the same situation. And the area of psychology, of course, personality is the study of individual differences. Okay. So let's get into the different approaches of how personality is and has been studied in the past. So, first, we have what is called the psychodynamic approach. And this approach is based on the idea that personality is primarily unconscious and motivated by some inner force and conflict that you're largely unaware of. Okay, so personality is driven by this sort of unconscious inner force that you don't know about, essentially. And of course, if you've never, even if you've never taken a psychology course, you might have heard the name Sigmund Freud. He was really the pioneer when it came to psychodynamic approaches when studying personality. And his overall theory was that the unconscious is the part of your personality that contains your memories, your knowledge, beliefs, your feelings, but all those things that you're mostly unaware of, but that still affect your behavior. So it's not the feelings or beliefs or urges that you're experiencing in the moment right now. It's more talking about those feelings that are sort of repressed or in your unconscious that you're unaware of. And he proposed that all behavior is determined or caused by some underlying psychological issue that you're also unaware of. So he was saying no behavior that you engage in are really accidental. Okay, they don't just happen, but rather they're caused by these unconscious conflicts that you're unaware of that are happening sort of below the surface. So, Freud is going to talk a lot about the conscious and also the preconscious and the unconscious self. So, first, he argues that the conscious experience, so that which you're aware of right now in the moment, what you're thinking right now, or what you're feeling right now, is only a small part of your psychological makeup and experience. He argues that what you're feeling right now or what you're thinking right now, that conscious knowledge and effort and belief, that only minimally influences the behaviors that you engage in. So he says that there is this conscious going on. There are these feelings and this knowledge that you have in the moment that you're aware of, but that is not what is influencing and causing your behavior in general. He also talks about the preconscious level, which contains material just below the surface of conscious awareness, but can easily be retrieved. Okay, so maybe it isn't happening right now. You're not thinking about it in this moment, but you could retrieve the information if necessary or if you had to. So, for example, if someone asks you, "What did you have for lunch yesterday?" Or what was your argument about that you had with your significant other over the weekend? So maybe it's not something that you're focusing on or thinking about now, but if someone was to ask you about it, you could retrieve that information, right? You could recall the information accurately and with really little to no effort. And finally, he talks about the unconscious. So he largely attributes our personality and what motivates your behavior and the behaviors that you engage in. He's going to argue that the unconscious influences you the most. This is what controls majority of your behaviors. So these are thoughts, memories, desires that are well below the surface of what he calls conscious awareness. So things you cannot easily retrieve. Okay, so different from the preconscious where you can easily retrieve that information, these you cannot. So forgotten trauma when you were a child, maybe you have hostility towards a parent, but you don't really understand or know why. You can't remember when you were that little. Repressed sexual desires because of something that happened to you during childhood, things like that. Now, I have to be transparent. I am a behavior analyst, so I do not subscribe to this approach of assessing personality and personality traits. And I think a lot of psychologists currently do pull into question this theory. But I'll talk about in a little bit why we still discuss Freud's theory. And even though maybe it's not something that we use all the time, the importance and significance that it had at the time it was presented. So here's just an image to kind of show you each of the levels that he's talking about. So at the top there, you have the conscious level. So that's where he's talking about like current or in the moment thoughts and perceptions. You have then the preconscious level, which is stored but easily retrievable knowledge or memories. And then you have, and as you can see, the biggest part of the iceberg, right, is the unconscious level. And that's what Freud is arguing is largely it's under the surface, but it's controlling all of your behavior. So things like fears, violent motives, selfish needs, irrational wishes, and so on and so forth. So that's just kind of an image to give you an idea of what this looks like, right? The three different levels. So, from this, Freud developed a theory that personality consisted of three separate but interacting components. Okay, so they're separate, but they're going to interact with each other. These things that we're talking about, I'm about to present to you, these are abstract mental entities. They're not actual physical structures in your body. Okay, so even though the way Freud talks about them kind of gives you the idea that there's some physical structure of the ID or the ego within you, but that is not the case. Okay, these are just abstract and what I would call hypothetical entities. Okay, they are not physical structures that you can actually study and observe. So first we have the ID. So this is at the unconscious level. So Freud argued that this exists from the time you're born and is associated with something called the pleasure principle. So where the goal is immediate reduction of tension or maximization of satisfaction. So at this level, the ID, this is typically associated with primitive or instinctual cravings or longings. So, primitive needs like hunger, sexual stimulation, aggression, irrational impulses, those things that bring you pleasure in the moment or relieve you from some tension or discomfort in the moment. Okay, so that's why we call it the pleasure principle. It's whatever is best for you in that moment. Then we have the ego, which is at the preconscious and unconscious levels. And the ego is sort of the more rational and logical part of personality that attempts to sort of balance out the impulsive desires of the ID. So the ego is more aware of the realities of the objective outside world. So rather than only being concerned with your own internal world, which you are in the ID level, the ego is more aware of your objective outside world, right? Reality that you live in. And this level typically develops in early childhood. So different from the ID that operates under what was the pleasure-seeking principle, right? The ego operates more according to something called the reality principle. So your instinctual urges are restrained at the ego level, really to maintain your own safety and to ensure that you can successfully integrate into society. If you always acted on every single impulse you had, people would probably get really annoyed really fast, right? So think of the ego as your more rational self, the mom voice you hear when you want to do something, but you know you shouldn't, right? That's the ego, as Freud would argue. And finally, Freud presented the superego. So this develops in late childhood. And according to Freud, this is the part of the personality that judges the morality of your own behavior. So developing your own sense of what is right versus wrong. And Freud argued that anxiety is caused by conflicts that exist in your unconsciousness. So even though you're unaware of them, they're still producing some effect on your behavior. And he stated that this conflict or interaction between the components of the psychic system that he's presented, so the unconscious, the conscious, and the preconscious, he refers to this as the psychodynamics of personality. Okay, so the interaction between all those three things, between the conscious, between the preconscious, and the unconscious. He's going to refer to those interactions between the three psychodynamics of personality. Okay. Typically, according to Freud, the ego is constantly sort of trying to balance out the ID and the superego. The ego is sort of stuck in the middle. Okay, so that's how you can kind of think of this. It's trying to make sure that the ID, that pleasure seeking part of yourself, isn't out of control. So you aren't just giving into every impulsive urge you might have. And then the ego is also balancing the superego, right? The other side of things, which is the judgmental and moral side of your personality. It also wants to sort of balance that out and make sure that the superego isn't calling all the shots and basically making you feel guilty for every behavior that you engage in, right? So the ego is sort of the balanced part of yourself. This is what Freud would argue. Now, because according to Freud, anxiety is produced because your unconscious repressed feelings or memories, that is what is causing your anxiety. Okay, so all of these repressed things in the unconscious then produces anxiety. So even though you might be aware of these unconscious feelings or memories or whatever it is that's happening below the surface, it creates this anxious feeling in you. And he suggested that people deal with this anxiety in a number of ways or using different defense mechanisms. Okay. So these are unconscious strategies that people use to reduce their anxiety by distorting their reality or as a way of concealing the source of their reality. A source of their anxiety from their own selves. So, really, you're going to convince yourself that you're not anxious, or you're just going to find a way to bury or ignore the anxiety altogether using one of or many of these defense mechanisms. Now, like I said before, Freud is arguing that these are things you engage in unconsciously. So there's this sort of constant conflict between the unconscious, the preconscious, and your conscious. And you might not be aware of all these conflicts, but you are engaging in these defense mechanisms to sort of balance things out. Okay. You can go through each of these on your own. They're pretty straightforward. They talk about them in the book, and it might get a little repetitive listening to me go through each and every one of them. But there is a really useful chart in your book on page 368 that gives you not just like the definition of each, but examples of how each of these defense mechanisms might be used. Okay, so I highly recommend maybe read through these, what each one is. And then if you want to see actual examples of those, go to page 368 and they have a table there with examples of each one that's really useful. Okay. So Freud also presents a theory showing how personality develops throughout our life. And he suggests that personality develops through a series of 5 stages that he calls the psychosexual stages. And you've probably heard of some of these before, even if you've never taken a psychology class. Each of these stages, Freud is arguing that children encounter conflicts between the demands of society and their own sexual urges. Okay. And when we're discussing these sexual stages, think more about experiencing pleasure in a broader sense, like what brings pleasure rather than this act of sex. Okay. The sexual lust specifically. That's sort of not what we're talking about until we get to the final stage. So even though they're called psychosexual stages, we're more just talking about like pleasure in general. Okay. And Freud argued that if you're not able to resolve these conflicts that occur at any particular stage, you might become sort of locked in that conflict throughout your life and even into adulthood. And you develop certain fixations depending on what stage you sort of get stuck in. Okay. And I'll talk about what those are in each stage. So first we have the oral stage. So this is associated from birth to about 12 to 18 months of age, so 1 to 1.5 years. And in this first stage, the baby's mouth is the focal point of pleasure. Okay, so children at this age, they bite, they suck, they eat, they put everything in their mouth, right? Essentially, they'll put anything they can get their hands on into their mouth. This is how they learn about and experience the world around them. Okay, so that's why he's going to argue that at this stage, the pleasure is focused around the mouth, right? If infants or children are overindulged at this stage, so let's say, for example, every single time a child cries, mom gives them food as a source of comfort, okay? They might become fixated on oral gratification in general. So this might produce behaviors in adulthood like smoking, overeating, talking a lot. So anything that involves gratification by mouth, essentially. It can produce these behaviors well into adulthood, is what Freud would argue. Okay. Next, we have the anal stage. So this stage typically occurs from about 1 to 1.5 years or 12 to 18 months until 3 years of age. And usually during this time, there is typically an emphasis on toilet training at some point, right? Most children are toilet trained between the ages of 2 and 4 at the latest, but usually around 2 or 3. So during this stage, children obtain pleasure from the retention and expulsion of feces. So it's such a fun thing to think about. But according to Freud, this is where they obtain pleasure at this age. Now, think of this more. Don't think about this literally. I think when we read this, and the first time I read Freud, I really was like, what is he talking about? How is this possible? Do children really get pleasure from this? Think of it more of a control issue. Okay. They do get pleasure from the sense of controlling whether or not they hold it or they go, especially during the toilet training process. Because if you think about it, up until that point, children are really, they just kind of go whenever they want to go, right? Like if their bodily urge is such that they need to go to the bathroom, whether it be urinate or defecate, they go, right? There's no restriction placed on that. And now all of a sudden, when you toilet train a child, not only are you telling them when to go, you're telling them where to go, you're telling them you could only go in the toilet. You can't be walking around anywhere you want to be and go. You have to take care of this nasty mess yourself now, right? Like mom's not going to clean you up anymore. There's all of these things that are happening. And ultimately, what's happening is all of the control is being taken away from the child, right? Where they had full control of where they went, when they went, whenever they wanted to. Now they're being given all these restrictions. And so, what ends up happening is the only thing they have control over is whether or not they go, right? Whether they hold it or whether they actually release it. Okay. So that's where this sort of pleasure center comes from. What Freud is saying is this level of control comes from being able to like hold your feces in or let it go, right? That's the only choice that they have left that no one else can force them to do, right? You can force a child to sit on a toilet. You can force a child to go in the bathroom and sit in the bathroom and stay in there for however long and so on and so forth, or drink tons of juice so they have to go to the bathroom. But you cannot force a child to go to the bathroom, right? They have control over their muscles and their body that allows them to release whatever they are doing. So that's what the fixation is at this stage. Okay. It's more control than anything else. And if toilet training is particular demanding in this stage, so if they have a really hard time with it, maybe it was kind of traumatic or things didn't go well, fixation in this stage can occur. Okay. This, according to Freud, can result in behaviors in adulthood revolving around control, right? So that control theme sort of stays. So these adults are more rigid or more orderly, right? They're obsessed with everything being in a specific way, or punctuality, being on time to everything, or early, and to a drastic extent. Okay, so not like your normal person who just likes to be on time, but we're talking like you have to be on time no matter what, right? Or things have to be in a certain order all the time, every time. So levels of control, if you get stuck in this stage, essentially, then can result in those behaviors in adulthood. Next, we have the phallic stage, which occurs from about 3 to 5 to 6 years of age. Okay, so here the main focus is on the genitals. And of course, pleasure that children receive from fondling themselves. So you often see young children with hands down their pants. Again, try not to look at this from the lens of you being an adult and thinking sex, right? This is just a child recognizing that certain parts of their body have more sensation than others, okay? And they're more interested in those parts because when they touch those parts versus when you just touch an elbow, it feels better, right? So, of course, they're going to spend more time and more focus on the genital area. Um, Now, there are a number of things going on during this stage that Freud talks about, or that Freud theorized on. One of them was the Oedipal complex. So this is where children are more attached to their parents of the opposite sex. And you can read about this in detail. This is based on a Greek drama where the main character was in love with his mom and he killed his dad, and like that's where we get the Oedipal complex, because it was Oedipus, was the Greek drama that this was sort of the name came from. But basically, Freud is going to argue that, the child must overcome this complex of being attached or sort of obsessed with their parents of the opposite sex. They have to overcome that in order to move on to the next stage. And a lot of the things, if you read about it in the book, it's very misogynistic, right? It's all based on male, it sort of looks down on the female role in all of this, with penis envy and things like that. Really interesting things, but I think you can read about it. I don't need to talk about it at length, but just know that all of that, according to Freud, is happening during the phallic stage. Okay. And he states that if individuals are unsuccessful in overcoming this stage, he's going to argue that all kinds of things can go wrong. Okay, so this is sort of a catastrophic stage if things don't go well into adulthood. So people can develop improper sexual behavior. So he would attribute things like pedophilia to this stage, or even failure to develop a conscience altogether, right? So not having a moral compass of right or wrong. So according to Freud, failure in this stage can be pretty catastrophic for your future as an adult. And then we have the latency stage that develops from 5 to 6 years of age and goes into right up until a child starts adolescence. Okay. And Freud stated that during this stage, sexuality is really repressed for the most part. There's really no erotic or pleasure focus in this stage. And sexual concerns are largely unimportant, which is pretty typical. Very young children are sort of always obsessed with having their hands down their pants. But once they hit 6 or 7 years old, they sort of stop doing that. They understand that that's socially unacceptable, not something you should do unless you're in private. And for the most part, kids are just kind of like not interested, right? It doesn't really hold their attention until they get to adolescenthood, right? Then it's a different story. Um, but issues during this stage might result, according to Freud, in immaturity in adulthood and maybe inability to form long lasting relationships. So essentially, what he's saying is that if people get stuck in this stage, right, then that can result in an immaturity level in adulthood. And finally, we have the genital stage. So this occurs during adolescence and continues into adulthood. Again, we have the erotic focus on the genitals, but it's now going to be different from that focus that we had in childhood. So the one during the phallic stage in childhood, that was simply a fixation on a body part that had more sensation than other body parts, right? But now the focus is on sexual intimacy. So mature adult sexuality, which Freud defines as the act of sex. Okay, so having sex. The experiences in this stage are focused around establishing intimate relationships and becoming a contributing member of society. Okay. There really aren't, once if you get to this stage, you've essentially, according to Freud, you're not going to have any fixations because you've successfully progressed through all of the stages, right? So those fixations only occur if you sort of get stuck in each stage. Okay. But if you've made it to the genital psychosexual stage, you've moved up through all the other ones successfully. You're now able to establish intimate relationships, you contribute to society, and you shouldn't have any sort of leftover fixations occurring in adulthood. Okay. So, as I kind of mentioned before, I'm not really a fan of Freud's theories. And many people today would argue against their validity in general. So, at the time when he presented them, even, they were really bold and far reaching. And a lot of people questioned what he was talking about. So, why do we even keep talking about it? Why do we still learn about it? So, any theory around behavior, no matter how implausible it might seem, you must consider the time it's developed and what was available in terms of technology for observing behaviors. So, Freud essentially saw individuals as engaging in he saw these individuals engaging in all sorts of behavior, right? And similar behaviors at similar ages. And he developed a theory around them. His theory was attempting to explain all of these behaviors that he's observing in children as they move through childhood, adolescence, and into adulthood. You also have to remember that they didn't have all this technology we now have for observing things like brain activity and neurological systems. Now we can sort of look internally at all this stuff. There is no physical construct that we would call the ID or the ego or the superego. There is no conscious or preconscious or subconscious that you can measure in any tangible way. And now that we have technology that actually shows us that, we know that for a fact, right? So that's the difference. Um, and additionally, Freud's theory for a very long time was a theory that's widely used in the field of psychology, and it is still used to some extent today. So it's important to talk about because at the time it was the thing. Freud's theory was, it was far fetched and it was out there, but it was new, it was sexy, right? It was the next upcoming thing. People used it. And additionally, his theory, although today it's not as widely used when talking about personality, it was sort of the jumping off point for the field of psychoanalysis, okay, which is a separate field of psychology and study. And we will get into that in detail later on. So that may have never developed to what it is today if it hadn't been for sort of the beginnings of the theory that Freud presented. So that's why we still learn about it today, even though it may seem as you're going through it, you're kind of talking about all these hypothetical constructs, and a lot of people question this. How do we measure this? How do we observe this? You can't, is the short answer. But we still need to learn about it. It still has historical importance for the field of psychology. So when considering whether a theory is a good one or not, we need to ask if there are sound constructs. So meaning, are the constructs specific enough to generate specific hypotheses? Okay, so is the hypothesis testable? Any good theory should be testable and falsifiable. We talked about this in the very first week when we talked about research methods in psychology, right? But Freud's theories consist completely of hypothetical constructs. They cannot be observed, they cannot be measured in any real way, which means that you cannot develop a hypothesis about it and test it, right? You can't, for example, test your hypotheses on the functioning of the ID as compared to the functioning of the ego, because these are not actual physical entities that you can measure and observe and develop a hypotheses around and test your hypotheses and so on and so forth. So many are starting to question and ultimately conclude that Freud's theories are not scientifically sound. So they are still used in some capacity, but not with any, I would say, like a finite, like this is the end all be all, right? So they might be used in a broad sense, but not, sort of like with a grain of salt, right? Additionally, behavior in Freud's theories is really hard to predict when you're using this theory. So, for example, how does the stage of the phallic stage, talk about behavior in any real way, right? Can you predict, for example, if someone in the phallic stage is messy or tidy, or if they're going to engage in one behavior over another? And you can't. The theory really doesn't tell us anything useful about behavior, right? You can't take the theory and then predict what behavior an individual is going to engage in. But any good theory about behavior should, in fact, do just that. It should lend to predicting behavior in an orderly way. I mean, that is the science of behavior, right? Being able to predict behavior. So I personally would conclude, as many others do as well, that this psychoanalytic approach doesn't really meet the criteria we have set within the scientific community as a good theory, right? It doesn't meet the standard or the merit that's been set forward. when we're talking about a science of behavior. Okay, so keep that in mind when you're thinking about the psychoanalytic approach. I encourage you, if this sort of sparks some interest, though, go look for it up. I mean, your book talks about it, but there's a lot more to his theory. I remember the first time I read it, I remember just thinking this, is kind of crazy. Did people really, think this? Is this what, why would they look at behavior this way? Why would they think about this behavior this way? And so it sort of sparked my interest in terms of like, I wanted to understand historically, like, why was this useful? And why were people using it? Because there has to be a reason, right? It's not that just that theories are presented and people just go, okay, like, people really went along with what Freud was saying. And it also spurred on a whole new set of theories with the new Freudians, right? So you've got Carl Jung, and other neo-Freudians that came after him. So if this at all sparks your interest, I encourage you to go look up some of his stuff, look up some of Carl Jung's stuff. So he was largely influenced by Freud, but he did sort of change some things here and there. It's fun to learn about, even if it's not something that you adhere to, which I don't. So, this isn't something that I would consider a good measure of behavior, but it's still fascinating to learn about. So I encourage you to go learn more about it if your interest was sparked. Okay, so let's talk about another approach, the behavioral approach. And this is largely what I studied, this field of behavior analysis. Okay. So this approach really doesn't focus on personality as a central area of study, because to behavior analysts, there really is no such thing as definitive personalities. Now, I know that sounds like a very bold statement, so just give me a second to sort of unwrap it and present it to you, because I know it is goes against the grain to say there's no such thing as personality, right? There's no such thing as personality in the sense that it's this thing that identifies you and controls your behavior. Now, of course, within our language and our society, we categorize people's behavior. And if you engage in a certain type or certain pattern of behaviors, then you have that type of personality, right? So we don't argue that, of course, in terms of our language and how we talk about patterns of behavior, we talk about personality. But as far as it being like a thing that controls your behavior, so your personality of being quote unquote shy controls all of the behaviors that you now engage in. So because you're shy, you do all of these things. We argue the opposite. Well, no, it's because you behave in all of these things, you do all of these behaviors, that people now categorize you as shy. So the reason you're engaging in a behavior is not because you're shy. People call you shy because the behaviors they observe you engaging in. Okay, so slight difference there in terms of how we talk about personality. We also adhere to the notion that you engage in these learned patterns of behavior. So like I said, people might, group these patterns of behavior together and label you a certain personality. So for example, someone who is categorized as shy or having a shy personality, we would look at all the individual behaviors that you're engaging in, okay, that resulted in the society calling you shy. So maybe you talk very quietly, you have a quiet voice. Maybe you're not the first person to say something in the room. Maybe you prefer to be in small groups or alone as opposed to being in large groups. Maybe you don't make eye contact as much when you're talking to people, and so on and so forth. So each one of those things is an individual observable behavior that we can watch you engage in. And if you see a pattern of these behaviors, people will say you're shy, right? But that's not the cause of your behaviors, according to behavior analysts. So all these individual behaviors, we can observe them, and then we can measure them. So how often you engage in them, what environments you engage in, what people you engage in them with, and we can predict how often you're going to engage in one behavior over another given your environment. So let's say, and if the person is reinforced for these behaviors, right, they're even more predictable. So if something good happens because you engaged in a certain behavior, you're likely to continue to engage in that behavior more often in the future. Just an example that I can think of off the top of my head, sticking with the theme of being shy. Let's say you're at a party and let's say you're shy, right? So you're with a girlfriend and she's loud and she talks for you and all these things. And she goes off to go talk to a group of people over there. And you're sort of just staying on the couch and you're quiet and you're alone. And a guy that you really like or thought was kind of cute, he comes over and start talking to you. So from behavior analytic perspective, the behavior that you engaged in with staying away from the large group, right? That's the behavior we can observe. You stayed alone, you weren't talking to anyone, and that behavior in this instance was reinforced, right? So perhaps because it just so happens that the guy that you wanted to talk to saw you sitting alone and came over to talk to you, okay? So your behaviors are reinforced in that instance. So what we would then predict is the next time you're at a party, you're more likely to sit alone because the last time you were at a party and you sat alone, it was reinforced. Now that can go the opposite way, and it often does. Maybe you're sitting at a party alone and something bad happens. It punishes your behavior. So maybe next time either you won't sit alone, maybe you'll follow your friend, or maybe you won't even go to the party at all, right? So you change your behavior because it was punished in that instance. But if a person is reinforced for their behavior, they're more likely to engage in that behavior in the future, and we can observe and predict those behaviors happening in certain circumstances. Now, the sum of all these behaviors, or the pattern of all these different behaviors that someone engages in, would lead society to call them shy or say they have a shy personality. But to the behavior analysts, we aren't really interested in that general label, but rather we're interested in the individual behaviors that you're engaging in, okay? Because those behaviors are what result in the label of shy. But it's not that you being a shy person from birth makes you engage in these behaviors. And in fact, there is a whole body of literature that talks about this, that children who are thought to be shy can be taught to not be shy, right? So through reinforcement of their behavior when they're young, you can actually change the behaviors that they engage in. And people would say, oh, you changed their personality. And we would argue, no, we just reinforced different behaviors. So they aren't being reinforced anymore for being quiet or sitting alone in the room. We're reinforcing them for something else. And so they're going to engage in those behaviors more in the future. Okay, so that's the perspective on personality from a behavioral approach. And finally, we have the humanistic approach. So this emerged in the 50s, sort of as a reaction to both the psychodynamic and behavioral approaches that were being presented. So this approach really emphasizes the unique quality of humans in their freedom and potential for growth and change throughout your lifetime. It's a really optimistic approach, an optimistic view of human nature. It sort of goes against the Freudian approach, where he argues we can't control any of our basic needs or impulses. The humanistic approach is going to say the opposite of that. They're going to say, no, your basic urges can be controlled and your behaviors are not dominated by some unconscious thing that you're unaware of. So you have control over the behaviors and impulses that you engage in. And this approach also argues that we have an innate, which means you're born with the motivation to attain your highest possible emotional and intellectual potential. So they call this self-actualization, that we're actually born with the motivation to make the best of ourselves that we can, so we can reach our full potential. This approach looks at personality in terms of one structure, so the self or self-concept, okay? This is a collection of beliefs about your own nature, your qualities, and your behaviors. So basically it's saying You are aware of your own self-concept, okay, or who you are, what you believe in, or the behaviors you engage in. That's your self or your self-concept. And it's really subjective. So you might distort experiences to create a more favorable self-concept, right? Or to keep the self-concept that you have intact, okay? And to do that, this approach looks at the congruence or incongruence between your sense of self and your experiences. So what this is talking about is there a match between, so is there congruence or is there a match between what you feel and what you behave? Okay, your feeling of who you are and then what you actually experience. So just an example of this, if you have a self-concept of kindness, so you think overall you're a kind person, okay, that's your self-concept. But then you have an experience where you were really unkind. Maybe you said a nasty comment to someone that was just really uncalled for and mean, okay? So now you have sort of this incongruence, this mismatch between your sense of self and your experience, right? And this can lead to a distortion of your experiences. So you can still reason that you are a kind person, right? So you might distort that experience in some way, downplay it, or say, oh, well, this person did this, so that's why I said it. Whatever you need to do to sort of bring the match back between your self-concept and the experience that you had, right? So that you can still say, I'm a kind person. So according to the humanistic approach, feelings of anxiety are the result of incongruences or that mismatch between your sense of self and your experiences. So you become motivated to defend your sense of self and engage in defensive processes to such as distortion or denial to make sure that that sense of self and your experience match, right? So to keep the congruency. So let's talk about distortion. You might distort an experience. So let's say you get a really good grade on an exam, but your sense of self is that you're a poor student. Okay. So what you'll do is you'll say, well, I got the good grade because of luck, right? Not because you're actually a good student. So you're not going to change your self-concept. You're going to distort the experience so that it matches your self-concept. So if you believe that you're not a good student, but you got a really good grade, you're going to say, oh, well, that was just luck. Okay. You're not going to attribute it to the fact that maybe you're actually a good student, right? Maybe you need to change your self-concept. And the same for vice versa, right? Let's say you're a good student or your self-concept is that you're a good student and you get a really bad grade on an exam. You're probably going to say something like, well, the teacher doesn't like me. Like they graded me way more harshly than they graded everyone else, right? You didn't get the bad grade because you maybe didn't study or you aren't actually that good of a student. You're not going to change your self-concept, okay? You're going to distort the experience to bring back sort of the match between your self-concept and the experience you had. And then we also have denial. So this is where you deny that an experience happened altogether. Okay, if it doesn't fit your sense of self, if there's an incongruence there, you just sort of deny that it happened altogether. Okay, there's really not a lot to say about it. It's literally that. Let's say you were unkind to someone and you just straight up say, no, I wasn't. I wasn't unkind to them. I didn't do that. Like that wasn't unkind. It's just straight denial of the experience. So here are all of the approaches summarized. Again, I know this is a lot of information being thrown at you, but I try to kind of summarize it in some main bullet points for each approach. So the psychodynamic approach, remember that it involves the unconscious forces. They're acting as determinants of your personality. Your personality is made up of three structures, according to Freud, right? The ID, the ego, and the superego. And we use defense mechanisms to deal with that anxiety that's caused by the unconscious. And then according to Freud, the development of personality occurs through the psychosexual stages that we went over in detail. Then the humanistic approach, so that looks at personality as one structure or the self concept, and it focuses on maintaining congruence between the self concept and your experience, right? So through denial and distortion, you maintain that congruence. And finally, we have the behavioral approach. So this adheres to the notion that there really is not such a thing as defined personalities that control your behavior, but rather only learned patterns of behavior that are reinforced throughout your life. And these can change as new patterns are learned or reinforced. And that concludes the first portion on chapter 10.